Okay, so good evening. Welcome again to the Medventions Innovation Lectures. Our topic today will be business modeling, and perhaps on a very high level, business modeling really answers the question of how you're going to make money. Maybe more precisely, how are you going to generate a revenue stream while delivering value to your target customers? And unfortunately, some innovators tend to delay this exercise of answering this question early on in the innovation process. And it's critically important to understand that your innovation, your idea, it can be medically compelling. It might have a sizable, large accessible market. It might be capable of clearing regulatory hurdles. But again, if there's no sound business model embedded into it, into your innovation, your solution, you're set for failure. Really, your business model really defines how your innovation offering works. So today we will be discussing the different types of business models that are typically utilized in the medical device space, including the relative advantages and disadvantages. We will also have, this is going to be done during the first hour lecture. We'll then have a break at 6 to 6:15, a dinner break, some networking, and then we will have a workshop where we will discuss the lean business model canvas and how you can basically deliver and communicate your business model. So I'm delighted to be introducing our guest speaker today, Dr. Harold Woodlinger. Harold is a consultant to the medical device industry. He has more than 30 years of experience in the medical device industry. He's the chairman of Rhythm Science. It's a cardiac EP products company and Exact Imaging, and he's the director of Chip Care. He's also an adjunct professor at the University of Toronto in the Institute of Biomaterials and Biomedical Engineering, where he teaches a graduate course in medical product development. Harold has led the design and development of more than a dozen commercial medical devices that have treated hundreds of thousands of patients, and is a listed inventor on more than 30 patents and patent applications. Harold, thank you very much for being our guest speaker today. Thank you. Looking forward to it.
Good afternoon, everybody. We'll make this fairly informal. If you want to interrupt me with questions during the talk, please don't hesitate. What Ahmed said is very true. When I started, I had a manufacturing business for a while, and when I started that business, my business advisor sat me down and said, "Tell me the two reasons why you're in business." And I said, well, the first reason is I want to save the world with these devices. And the second reason is I want to make money. And he said, "I'm so glad to hear you say reason number two. Because if you don't say reason number two, you're going to fail. Has to be on your mind. If you don't make money, you don't get to save the world." It's quite the bottom line. Anyway, I'm here to talk to you about business modeling and business strategies. And when you start out, you have a great idea for a product or for a service. You're not going to start a business until you've gone through a course like this. You've probably learned already that user needs are the most important thing. They've got to be verified. You've got to do your market research. You've got to establish technical feasibility of your idea, do your risk assessment, all that stuff. Once you've done that, you have to decide, I'm going to form a company, or I'm just going to go to the technology transfer office and have them do a patent and have them license it out for me. If you're going to form a company, you generally have to do it on a full-time basis. It's a big leap. You're taking a big risk. But a lot of people do it, and a lot of people become very successful doing it. So I'm going to assume you decided to form a company. Generally, if you've come up with a new idea, you're either going to be a licensing company, or you're going to design the company to be acquired by one of the big medical device firms, or you're going to design the company to be independent, long-term wealth creation company. Those are the three most common business models, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. Okay, that's not to say that these are the only business models. And which one is best? The answer is they're all the best. It just depends on what type of product service you have, what market you're going after, how much financing is available, etc. So there's no one answer to which one of them is the best. As I said, there's lots of other business models. I've listed a few here. Service provider. There are companies that provide sterilization services, testing services, sales services. I've listed a few of them. There are lots of distributors of medical devices. You can see I've picked out a few of them. You can see the Canadian flags for the ones that are Canadian. You can be an OEM manufacturer. That is, that you provide parts to the big medical companies. And there's more. There's consulting, regulatory consulting, quality consulting, reimbursement consulting, management consulting. So I started off, actually, after I worked for a medical device company for a while. When I first formed my company, I was a consulting company. And finally, there's contract developers and contract manufacturers. So companies that develop products like Starfish Medical, which is one of the biggest, not only in Canada, but in North America. RMF Design here in Toronto. Lots of companies do contract manufacturing. And question for all of you, if you don't have a product or a service that you've come up with that you want to form a company around, how would you get yourself into one of these other business models? How does it happen? Anybody have any guesses? Well, the answer is, in general, you work for one, and then you branch out on your own. So as I said, for me, I worked for a consulting company for a while. I became partners with somebody who had worked for a big consulting company. Did some consulting jobs for some distributors, learned about distribution business, then became a distributor. And then after I became a distributor, we came up with some product ideas of our own, developed them, and became a manufacturer. So that's how it happens. But anyway, let's get back to the topic. I'm going to discuss 3 business models in depth today. The license model, managing for acquisition, and managing for independent growth. And for each model, I'm going to go over what it is, the characteristics, the strengths and the weaknesses, and when to use it, and how to manage it. And then I'll do a couple of case studies to try and drive home the point, and then give you a summary. Any questions? No? Okay. So we're going to start with the license model. Some examples. Very famous example, Surmodics does coatings for nearly every catheter in existence. They have antibacterial coatings, antithrombotic coatings, lubricious coatings, you name it, they have it. And they supply to everybody. Big company in the United States. More high-tech, Context Vision is a company in Europe which does image processing. They supply image processing to almost every medical imaging specialty, including MRI, CT, and ultrasound. They are working with a couple of the companies here in Toronto right now. So they're licensing. They have their own proprietary intellectual property. In other words, they have patents that they own. They have technology that nobody else has, and it applies to manufacturers across a large spectrum of medical devices. That's a licensing company. It's very similar, for example, to Intel. Intel has microprocessors. They have intellectual property around those microprocessors, and they have production capacity, and they supply their microprocessors to every large computer manufacturer. So it's pretty much the same thing. License model, they're R&D focused. So some of them do some manufacturing, but most of them are simply R&D. They're what's called a horizontal model. So they go across a whole area. The customers are medical device manufacturers, and they're paid through royalties. Okay, is that clear? So strengths. Nice thing about the license model is there's generally not much capital required. You have to have capital to develop your technology, of course, but you're not the one doing the clinical trials, which are really expensive. You're not generally the one getting regulatory approval. It's the final manufacturer that does that. Another strength of the license model is you have all of these sales forces selling your stuff. You're not doing any of it. You're licensing to let's say you license a product to Medtronic. Medtronic goes out and sells it. You've got thousands of salespeople working for you, and the orders just come in, which is nice. The other nice thing, probably the most important thing, is that you can sell to everybody. So, for example, if you're making a part for a pacemaker, and you sell that part to every pacemaker manufacturer, then every pacemaker that gets implanted has your part in it. Whereas if you're a manufacturer of pacemakers, you've got 20% of the market or 30% of the market. But as a licensing contractor, you're selling to everybody. Okay, so that sounds pretty sweet, but there are some weaknesses. And one of the main weaknesses of a license model is you generally have no contact with the end user. And that means you get stale. If I'm supplying a part for a pacemaker, the end user, who is the physician implanting the pacemaker, doesn't talk to me, talks to the pacemaker manufacturer. So I don't know what's going on. And a lot of license people get stale. Margins are low. So if you're selling a part to a pacemaker manufacturer, the pacemaker manufacturer is going to make 70 or 80% margin on the product. You're not going to make anywhere near that. Why? Because you're a cost of goods. You're a cost of goods, and it's in the interest of the manufacturer to pay as little as possible for that. And there's also no security. So because you're a cost of goods, manufacturers are always trying to increase their margin percentage, and that means they have to drive down cost. So they are constantly after you to get your costs lower. And if they can replace you with something with lower cost, they will do it in a heartbeat. There's not much loyalty there. So that's the license model. When do you use it? Well, you have a proprietary technology or software with significant barriers to development. In other words, you're the only ones who have it. It's patentable, etc. And medical device companies across a wide spectrum need it. So things like coatings or things like image analysis. Companies need it now. They need it because their competitor has it. They want it now. They don't want to spend the time and energy to develop it. And in any case, you have a patent on the technology that looks really good. And the nice thing about the license model is if you have something that everybody wants, you can sell it pretty quickly. You can get it into everybody's shop. So how do you how do you manage for the license model? The main take-home message is if you're going to use a license model, you want to get in touch with your potential customers very quickly. You want to make sure that your product, your technology product that you're licensing is what they want. You don't want to spend all kinds of time and energy developing something, have it go to them and they'd say, well, yeah, this is nice, but I'd buy it if it was blue instead of red. You want to find out that it needs to be blue before you start to develop it. Another thing for managing for the license model is do not sign exclusive deals because you're really violating the model. So I had a client out of Israel. They developed a segmentation software for CT. Philips came along and said, we love this, we want to license it exclusively. And they thought, they'd died and gone to heaven because it's Philips. 3 years later, Philips replaced them. Philips actually developed their own because they thought that this one coming out of Israel was too expensive, and it was pretty expensive. So Philips replaced them, gave them 1 month notice, and they had no other customers. So if you're going to use this model, use the model properly. You're going to have to customize your offering. Everybody's going to want it a little bit different. And most important piece of advice is find a way to stay in touch with the end user. There are ways to do that. Even though they're not buying from you, you can have, for example, a medical advisory board that you pay and that you meet with every 3 months or 4 months, and they tell you what's going on and what you should be working on. You've got to stay in touch with the end user. Okay, so that's the license model. Yes?
By saying be flexible, this goes after the patent, like extra boundary of the patent?
Right, and it can lead to more patents. So, for example, context vision, I brought up before. They've done image analysis for ultrasound, for general purpose ultrasound machines. I direct a company called Exact Imaging, which is an ultrasound company. We went to Context Vision and said, we have these particular requirements because what we're doing is we're looking at the prostate. And there are certain characteristics of the prostate that we need to bring out. And they said, okay, we'll work with you on that. They were flexible enough to adapt their algorithm for our needs. Yeah.
The flexibility, take it further, especially that company example that you discussed.
Yes.
Where they were, part of the problem for them wasn't, part was that they were exclusive, but the other part was that they probably, their pricing was not in keeping with a model that would discourage, it would be enough of a, wouldn't convince them to try and find some other alternative way. So,
no, you're absolutely right.
Judge the sort of the pricing of these kind of things so that you don't get them too interested in replacing.
Pricing is an art. It's not a science. And, there's a saying in business that pigs get fat, but hogs get slaughtered. So you need to be a pig so that you make money. But if you're a hog, you get slaughtered. And this company overpriced themselves. You're absolutely right. But, if you're in that situation and you have this technology, you always try and go for, you set a high bar. You think, everybody thinks that it's their baby and it's worth a fortune. I think part of the problem was that when this company started out with Philips, they were charging about $15,000 a copy. And at that time, it was worth it because nobody else had it. But 3 years later, other people were developing similar technologies. The price was coming down, and they had lost contact with that aspect of the market. They didn't realize this was happening. They should have been reducing their price in line with the market, and they didn't do that. Yeah.
Isn't that patent protection is also not broad enough?
Well, patent protection, when you file a patent, you try and make it as broad as you can. But the patent office comes back to you and says, it's too broad. It's got to be narrower. And eventually you compromise with the patent office and you get a patent that, is as good as you can get. No patent is going to stand up, especially a technology patent. A drug patent can stand up forever. But a technology patent, there's always more than one way to skin a cat. And there's always ways around things. So, your patent does provide some degree of protection. But it's not perfect. And especially it's not perfect for a small company. And this was a small company. So typically, if you're a big company, you can afford to defend your patent. But if you're a small company, you really can't. You can't take on a company like Philips. It's just not going to happen. Anyway, let's move on to the acquisition model because that's what everybody wants to hear about anyway, right? Some acquisition examples: Canadian companies, Cryocath out of Montreal. They got acquired for $380 million. They were making a couple of different models of catheters that did cryoablation. So these were cardiac catheters, and their most successful one was aimed at atrial fibrillation, which was a very hot topic and still is. Visual Sonics was a company in Toronto, which was started by Stuart Foster out of Sunnybrook. And Visual Sonics got acquired by Sonosite for $68 million a few years ago. And both of these were considered very successful acquisitions. But you'll notice on here that both of them had realized about $32 to $35 million in sales by the time they got acquired. So why do you think Cryocath got bought for more than 5 times what Visual Sonics got bought for? Yes.
Patent rights.
They both had lots of patents. Both had lots of patents, yes.
Potential market?
Essentially, not just potential market, but the type of market. So if you look at Cryocath had a therapeutic product, a product that did therapy. Visual Sonics had a diagnostic product. Furthermore, the Cryocath product was being used on humans. And the Visual Sonics product at that time was only being used for animal research. So if you have a product that's therapeutic, it's worth a lot more than a diagnostic product. If you have a product that's used on humans, it's worth a lot more than a product that's used for animal research. Yeah.
But if you have a product in the preclinical domain, do you gamble and invest for you to have a product that gets in the therapeutical in the clinic?
Well, that's a very good question, and a lot depends on whether you have the money to do it. I was on the board of Visual Sonics, and I was pushing very, very hard for them to move into the clinical space because I knew that it would increase their valuation dramatically. They were never able to raise the money to do that, and Sonosite is an ultrasound manufacturer that sells to clinics, and they came along and they said, gee, this would be great for humans. So they bought it, and they brought it into the clinic. Yeah.
How did Cryocath manage to get to the file for clinical trials with the approval of Canada? Or?
Yeah, they did everything. They their intention right from the very beginning was to go into humans. They raised a huge amount of money. Cryocath went public, and they had the largest public offering of a medical device company in Canada up to that point. It was a record. So they had lots of money. They did their clinical trials. They did all that stuff. They did it right. Okay, so characteristics of an acquisition model. A proprietary, disruptive product with very strong IP. So if you want to get acquired, the acquiring companies want products that are proprietary, in other words, unique. They want products that are disruptive. They don't want a slight improvement or even a nice improvement over what's there now. They want something that is going to disrupt the market so that it's going to be big. And they want very strong IP. They also want a product that is synergistic to products that they already have. What does that mean? It means that your product helps them sell more of their products. So in the case, for example, of Visual Sonics, Sonosite said, gee, if we add this really high-frequency ultrasound, we'll sell more of our ultrasound products. And in the case of Medtronic buying Cryocath, Medtronic had just started a whole division to do atrial fibrillation. They had all kinds of products. They wanted more things for their salespeople to sell. And by adding Cryocath, they could sell everything that the electrophysiologist needed. Acquisition model, you need to be in a hot market. So if you come up with a better surgical heart valve, nobody's going to acquire you. It's not a hot market, it's an old market. You come up with a better catheter-based heart valve, then you got a chance, because that's the hot market. The hot market right now, for example, is artificial intelligence. Money is just pouring into artificial intelligence for medicine. So if you have something that is proprietary, disruptive, strong IP, synergistic to selling other products, and in a hot market, then you've got a real shot. As I said before, valuation is much higher for products that are therapeutic, and especially for products that have a disposable as opposed to capital. Again, going back to Cryocath had a disposable catheter. Visual Sonics had capital equipment, an ultrasound console. The acquisition model typically requires very high, a lot of financing, very high development costs, very high clinical testing costs. So in general, for the acquisition model, you can't just go to family and friends for financing. You can't just go to angel financing. You have to go to venture capital, because a lot of money is required. Sometimes acquisitions are pre-revenue if it's a really hot market. Most of the time, you have to wait until you have a reasonable level of sales, because even the big companies, they want to acquire companies with a characteristic they call accretive. In other words, they want to acquire a company that has at least hit break even, because that way there's no hit to their bottom line. Their stock price is a multiple of their profit. If you're going to lose $10 million, if you're going to spend $20 million next year doing clinical trials and they acquire you, that comes right off their profit statement. Okay, so strengths and weaknesses. Without a doubt, the acquisition model is the fastest way to get rich. If you are the CEO or the founder of a company that is destined for acquisition, and you still own a reasonable percentage of that company, acquisitions are in the range of $50 million to $1 billion, and it is the fastest way to get rich. It can also be the best way to make a big difference in the world. So if you develop a product and you form a company and you raise a small amount of money and you start selling it 1 by 1 or even 10 by 10, it's going to take you many, many years for that product to really affect the standard of care. Whereas if you have a company like Medtronic or Boston Scientific or Siemens or Philips selling your product and they really go at it, you can affect the standard of care very, very quickly. And that's something that, it stays with you. You can be very proud of. And finally, from the acquisition model, you got a track record. If you're the founder or you're the CEO, you got a track record that nobody can ever take away. Okay, but there are weaknesses. One weakness right now is that we are kind of in startup heaven in Ontario right now. There are lots and lots and lots of startup companies. All of the universities are encouraging startup companies. All the hospitals are encouraging startup companies. And all of those startup companies are going to a fairly small number of venture capitalists and angels in this country. So there's huge competition for money at the startup level. There's a lot of money available, but the competition is huge, and it takes a lot of effort and a lot of time. Secondly, in the acquisition model, you are going to have a loss of control. Now, when I say this, everybody says to me, well, I'm only going to let them invest 49%, and I'm going to keep 51%, so I'm going to keep control. You're fooling yourself. Anytime you take anybody else's money, it's not just the percentage that you give up that counts, because you're going to have to sign a shareholders agreement. And that shareholders agreement says, The minority shareholders have the following rights, and those rights can be pretty vicious. One right, for example, is you have to form a board of directors. You form a board of directors and the minority shareholders get a certain number of seats. You as the founder get a certain number of seats. But you're no longer your own boss. You're reporting to that board of directors. And that board of directors can fire you. So I once was an advisor to a prominent venture capital firm. And during the years I was there, they made 17 investments, startups, all acquisition model, because that's what venture capitalists like. Of the 17 investments, within 3 years, they had fired 16 of the founders and replaced them with professional CEOs. So it happens. I mean, they were pretty extreme. Those numbers are not typical. But nonetheless, venture capital companies, once they become your shareholders, they can be pretty vicious. So that's a competition. That's a problem. Another weakness is very high risk. A lot of companies designed for acquisition fail. You can have setbacks. For example, you do a clinical trial, you don't make your primary outcome, there's not enough money to do another trial. The other thing that people don't talk about is if you get acquired, typically you have to work for the parent company for a number of years. And very often the parent company does not do such a great job. They're not as dedicated to your product as you were. And very often you watch them, you've kind of given them your baby, and very often you watch them mismanage it, which can be difficult. So when to use it, I think I've talked about that. You need a big market with high growth potential. Question I am always asked is it a moral thing to do to start a company, design it to be acquired, and then have it be acquired usually by Americans? It's a question I'm asked all the time. And most people think that it's rather immoral, that it's a terrible thing, that money should stay in Canada. And certainly there are some negatives. So you get acquired by a US company, sometimes the US company will move you down to the US, you have a brain drain going out of Canada. Sometimes layoffs occur. Sometimes even the entire company is relocated. And it often results in a loss of business for local suppliers. So if you were getting your product manufactured by one of the Canadian contract manufacturers, very often will get shifted down into the States or overseas. So these are real negatives for companies that are acquired, but there are a bunch of positives. One positive is it brings a lot of money into the country. Typically, entrepreneurs with successful track records are hot commodities for investors. They start up new companies. And basically, it's training. So, for example, I had a manufacturing company. It got acquired by a U.S. company. When we were acquired, we had about 55 people working for us. Of those 55 people, 2 of them are now CEOs of medical device companies. 5 of them are vice presidents, manufacturing, sales, different areas. But they stayed in Canada, they started new businesses, and my one business has now benefited at least 7 other medical device businesses. And this is real because one of the biggest problems we have in Canada in the medical device industry is a lack of senior management. There aren't a lot of people out there who've done it before. The other thing is everybody thinks that you get acquired and automatically you get transferred down to the United States. But there are a lot of companies that don't. So for example, CryoCath is still in Montreal, and they are about twice as big as they were when they got acquired. My company was left in Toronto, and 6 years later was also twice as big as when it was acquired. Lots of companies stay, and why do they stay? Because when you acquire a company, you're acquiring the people, not just the technology. And the people are valuable, and a lot of them don't want to relocate, especially Canadians don't want to relocate. So a lot of US companies will keep companies in Canada, and there's a lot of tax advantages for doing that as well. There's the low Canadian dollars, there's the shreds, which support R&D. And as I said, you have continuity with the people. Any questions about that? Yeah.
Say you have a product and you're looking for acquisition,
Uh-huh.
and you know that company is they're pretty much your primary competitor in the field of diabetes, for example.
Right.
Would you actually go to them before they look at you to maybe put up maybe a sample to show them why they should acquire you?
The answer is usually yes. So in general, you keep potential acquirers, not necessarily competitors, but companies that could acquire you, you keep them informed of what you're doing. And very often they'll be very helpful. Very often they'll say, you should orient the product this way. It would make us much more interesting. So yes, you keep them informed, you keep on their radar. And they know you're talking to them, and they also know you're talking to everybody else. So in general, there's always a risk that they're going to try and end run you, but you take lots of risks in this business. Yeah.
If you're working with medical research institutes, for example, St. Kitts Hospital here, and then they contribute to the IP you are creating.
Yes.
And the IP gives value for acquisition.
Yes.
But some of these institutes, their IP policy is very bad for acquisition. How to manage that? By very bad, I mean they impose the rules for co-owning IP in with a big chunk of ownership. That's repelled species.
Yes. No, you're quite correct. So, what you have to do is when you come up with something that you think could be acquired many years from now, you go and negotiate the best license deal that you can, and you get some pretty good advice. So you don't do it yourself. You get, find some people who've done this before, a lawyer or whoever, and get some very good advice, because you're right. If you make a mistake with that license agreement, nobody's going to invest in your company. Long time ago, hospitals and universities did not write many deals. They were insisting on terms that made no sense from a business perspective, but they were so afraid of being taken advantage of that they wanted these terms in there. And things have gotten a lot better. Most of the universities are much more knowledgeable about what investors are going to need to see. And so things are getting better. Yeah.
Your experience, how much does a founding CEO end up having in capital after an acquisition?
It's all across the board. What it really depends on is how much financing you need. So, in the case of Cryocath, for example, they had 7 or 8 rounds of financing, including going public. They were spending money like drunken sailors, and I think the CEO at the time of the acquisition owned around 4%. Now, in a lot of cases, I would say average, probably 30%. Yeah.
You were saying that a lot of founder CEOs were getting replaced by professional CEOs.
Yes.
How does a professional CEO resume look like?
People who had done it before.
Okay, that's it.
That's it. So what a venture capitalist wants is they want somebody who has done what's called an exit. An exit is an acquisition. So if you go to a venture capitalist, if a venture capitalist says we need to replace our CEO, their ideal candidate is somebody who has done 2 or 3 exits already, because they know how to get an exit, and that's what the venture capitalist wants. Okay, moving on. A lot of people will tell you that companies are bought, not sold. It's kind of the standard motherhood phrase. In other words, people will come to you. I can tell you it's not entirely true. You can manage a company for acquisition. And we've talked about some of these things. One of the things for acquisition is you've got to focus. The moment you start a company, there's all kinds of distractions, people suggesting other things. You've got to focus, and you've got to execute, and you've got to get it done. To manage a company for acquisition, you've got to get top key opinion leaders on your side. So you've got to have a medical advisory board with top key opinion leaders, both for investment, because professional venture capitalists, they know these key opinion leaders, they're going to go to them for advice, but also for acquirers. If you know that Dr. Smith is on the Medtronic advisory board, and you can get Dr. Smith on your advisory board, well, that makes that acquisition a whole lot easier. Recruit experienced executives and a great board of directors, even if you've never been a CEO before. The key to getting the confidence of investors is to recruit people, surround yourself by people who have done it before. So you get a board of directors, including some people who've had a few exits. You get a vice president of R&D who's developed a dozen products. You get a vice president of finance who's done all kinds of financing. You get people, you surround yourself with people who are really good, and you will get the confidence of the venture capital community. Okay, it sounds obvious. It's not easy to do, but you can do it. What else? You partner with potential acquirers early. That was the question that was asked before. Keep people informed of what you're doing. Get them to the point where they're worried that somebody else is going to grab you up. And then create value by eliminating risk. So go after the technology risk, go after the clinical risk, the regulatory risk, the market adoption risk. Eliminate each risk one at a time, because the big acquiring companies do not like risk. They want to step in there when all the risks are gone, and they can just go in and pretty much guaranteed to make money. Okay, and the final thing is you need a strong balance sheet, which means you need a lot of money. So when you negotiate for acquisition, if you are within 3 weeks of running out of money and closing down, you are not going to get a good deal. Just makes sense. Okay, any final questions on acquisitions? Yes.
So when it comes to creating IP and patents, sometimes with a startup, you don't have enough money, you have good ideas, you start working on it, but it's a race. Somebody else with more money might have find something already. How would you manage that
Get money.
Using the patent upper hand?
So the first round of financing is known as family and friends. If you believe strongly enough in your product, you are going to convince people around you to invest for founder shares. If you can't do that, then it's pretty hard to get to the next step. Now, if you're coming out of a university or a hospital, you can get them to make that investment. You give up some ownership, you have to pay a royalty, but it's worth it if you can get a reasonable deal. Okay, final one, and this will go fairly quickly, independent model. We have I think the biggest independent medical device company in this country is Baylis Medical. Baylis is doing extremely well. They're mostly in cardiology. They're hiring 100 people this year. I had somebody come in to my class and give a guest lecture from Baylis, and he was handing out business cards saying, "We want 20 of you." They're independent, which means they're around for the long term. They've got 2 huge manufacturing facilities, and they're doing great. Canavi is another company that is intending to remain independent. also out of Sunnybrook. I think you know the CEO quite well, and Brian Courtney. And they have 2 products right now. They've received FDA approval, and their hope is to remain independent, and they've designed the company to remain independent. So independent models, basically you are trying to provide a family of products, not just one product, and that's one of the big differences between the independent model and the acquisition model. It's a family of products. Why do you need a family of products? Because if you're out there with a sales force, that sales force has to have more than one product. They have to go in to the radiology department and say, we have everything you need, not just one thing. In this country, if you want an independent model, you're far better off to have a class 1 or class 2 product. Stay away from the class 3 products, PMA products, because they're just too expensive to get through regulatory. Baylis is entirely class 1 and class 2 products. Canavia is class 2 products, and a lot of the independent companies are. When you get big enough, like Medtronic's an independent company, but they've got billions of dollars in sales and they can afford to do all the clinical trials and everything else that they need to do. Independent model, you're not going to raise as much money as a venture-backed acquisition model. So you have to be frugal. You have to develop products at fairly low cost. And you have to develop products that have a great value proposition but are not necessarily disruptive. So Baylis, for example, their major product replaces a product that works reasonably well. Their product is clearly better, and people are buying it. They're not going to get acquired for that, but they're very happy being an independent company. For the independent model, you have to have a long-term focus. It takes a long time to become successful as an independent company. It took Baylis probably a generation. Strengths. You retain control of your products and your future. That's a big strength. You can pass it on to your children. Long term, you can get very wealthy. So the acquisition model is the best way to get wealthy in the short term. By short term, I mean 5 to 10 years. But for the independent model, it's generational. You retain all your ownership, or a lot of your ownership, and it is the best option for the economy, so you get government support. Baylis, for example, got a $15 million grant from the federal government to open a new manufacturing facility because the federal government realized that Baylis was being successful, number one, and that this money would translate into hundreds of jobs, which it has. Weaknesses. It is very long-term. It can take 10, 20 years before you're at the point where you're really successful. And it is more difficult to capitalize because venture capital is typically not available for this model. Why isn't capital available for this market, for this model? Basically, venture capitalists are short-term thinkers. And short-term, again, in the medical device world is four to 6 years. Why are they short-term thinkers? Because they also have a boss. They raise money from governments and pension funds and wealthy individuals, and those people expect a return on investment. And they expect a quarterly report, and they expect a yearly report, and they expect to see the value of their investment going up. Well, how do you value a company that does not have sales yet? Very difficult thing to do. So the easiest way for them to report back to their shareholders and the people they've raised money from is to say we've had exits. So that's what they're looking for. The other thing is that the partners in the VC firms, they get incentivized by exits. And the partners very often will make huge amounts of bonuses if they have an exit of one of the companies that they've brought in. Okay, so how do you manage for the independent model? You identify markets that have largely been ignored. by the big companies. The big companies are pursuing what's hot, and very often things that are not hot, that have been around for years and years and years, have not been improved for decades. And so they're available. Identify markets that have independent distributors, because that way you don't have to hire a sales force. Yes, you give up some of your margin for independent distributors, but you don't have to finance a sales force that's going to lose money for the first 3 years. The most important thing about managing for the independent model is to be upfront with your investors. So if you go to investors and you say, look, I just need money, and they invest money in you, 99 times out of 100, they're going to expect that you're looking for an exit. And in fact, in many shareholders' agreements, even if a venture capitalist only owns 30% of the company, the option to exit goes to them. It's no longer the CEO's option, it's their option. So they'll say, if you haven't exited after 5 years, we get the opportunity to arrange an exit for you, and they can make the decision. So you have to be upfront. One of the very good things that Canavi did when they raised money was they told everybody, we're using the independent model. We're going to continue to use the independent model. We're here for the long term. Made it more difficult for them to raise money. Venture capitalists in general were not interested, but they raised money, a lot from angels and from other people, and they were able to raise the money. So that was a good thing. A lot of independent companies are financed without a lot of investors. So Baylis, for example, was a distributor. Baylis Medical was started as a distribution house by the current owner's mother, and then Frank Baylis took over, did distribution for a while, realized that he should have his own products, gradually shifted over to become a manufacturer, but he used all the money that he made from distribution to fund his own R&D, so he didn't need investors. It was actually the same with my company. We started out as consultants. We used the money we made from the consulting and from product distribution to finance our own R&D and came up with our own products, and we didn't need any investors. It was easy to do back then because it didn't cost millions and millions of dollars to get through FDA at that time. Harder to do now. When to use the independent model, as you can see, your goal is to create lasting value. You have access to non-traditional sources of funding. You have deep expertise within a medical specialty. Remember this, you want a family of products. So you have deep expertise within one specialty. You are, for example, a kidney specialist, and you know everything about what all the kidney specialists do and what they're looking for. And you have ideas for a whole line of products. Okay, so that's the independent model. Any questions before we move on? We have about 5 minutes to do case studies. Yes?
You talk about their independent model after the family owns the business.
Sometimes it's the family that owns the business. In my case, for example, I had a partner. We had 50% each. So, it all depends. But it can be a family business, absolutely. In the case of Baylis, it was a family business. Baylis is still owned. Frank has a partner now, but basically there's two people who own that company. Okay, so I'm going to show you 3 companies. These are all real. Oh, yes, sorry, go ahead.
I was just curious, in the case of the licensing model, would licensees usually want to see clinical trial data or some clinical evidence? If you have IP around it, do they want to also see the clinical data, or is the IP enough to...
Sometimes, but not usually. So, for example, Surmotics. Now, they have a coating. They can't do a clinical trial because you got to coat something. So the catheter companies would say, okay, we're going to get your coating, and then we'll do the clinical trial. Sometimes they'll ask for some financial contribution to that clinical trial, but in general, it's the final manufacturer that does the clinical trial. Anyway, I'm going to present 3 companies quickly. You're going to tell me which model they chose or which model they should choose. These are all real companies. First one is Rhythm Science. Rhythm Science, as you can see, has 3 products for cardiac electrophysiology, a steerable introducer, a fixed curve introducer, and an integrated transeptal dilator and needle. They were started about 4 years ago. They've developed these 3 products. They got their financing from a distributor who saw the value of those products and wanted exclusive distribution in a couple of countries. And they plan for a full toolkit for the electrophysiologist. What's their model? Independent, absolutely. So they got non-traditional financing, which was from a distributor. They're developing a full line of products. The CEO has very deep knowledge of this space, has been in this space for 40 years, knows what everybody wants, knows all these products. These are not disruptive products, but they're products that have been ignored for a long time.
Your attention, please. Code blue. C, Charlie Wing, 3rd floor, room 61, bed 1. Your attention, please. Your attention, please. Code blue. C, Charlie Wing, 3rd floor, room 61, bed 1.
Okay. Any questions about Rhythm Science? Got it right. Good. Okay. 2 is Interface Biologics. Canadian company, came out of University of Toronto. They have a type of coating which is quite remarkable. Their coating is not a coating. They inject a chemical into the extruder, and the chemical goes to the surface. It's a surface modification technology, and it's made during the extrusion process. So it adds very little cost. It can't be wiped off. Great product. And what model? License model, absolutely. So they've licensed it, I think, to about 5 different companies now. One of them is Kendall, that makes surgical gowns. So they're making antibacterial surgical gowns, which is quite neat. They're doing about $5 to $8 million worth of business a year, and they're going after a whole breadth of products to a whole different types of medical devices. And final one is Cardio Insight. You know about this one. And there's only one model left, so you're going to get this right away. But Cardio Insight did a non-invasive 3D mapping system. Great product. It could map atrial fibrillation, which is something that all of the invasive mapping systems can't do. And the reason it could do that is it sees the whole heart at the same time. It was acquired by Medtronic 2 years ago. They did quite well, and Medtronic is selling the product now. But hot area, atrial fibrillation, it's been one of the hottest areas of medicine for the past 10 years. Very proprietary product. It was cardiac mapping from the outside. Nobody else had that. One product, disruptive. It allowed you to do cardiac mapping outside of the electrophysiology lab. Could do it right in the patient room. Basically, they're trying to change the standard of care for treating arrhythmias, especially atrial fib. Yeah.
What are the metrics you're looking for to characterize a hot market?
Uh-huh. Okay.
Would it be the amount of money injected, or?
It's basically what everybody's talking about. You know, it's a fad. It's like everything else. The venture capitalists, they latch on to buzzwords. So, for example, artificial intelligence is the buzzword of the day, and huge amounts of money are going into that right now. And the venture capitalists get to the point where they think, if I don't invest in an AI company, I'm going to miss the boat. And they do think that way. They really do. So they look for one. Atrial fibrillation 5-6 years ago was exactly the same. All the venture capitalists wanted to invest in atrial fibrillation, and they all did. So it's really a matter of, TAVI or TAVR 5 years ago was the hottest thing to hit medicine for a decade. Everybody was investing in one. And so, you'll know what's hot.
Okay, so Google Trend search.
There you go. Okay. So I have actually two final slides for you. This is just a summary of everything we've talked about. I don't think there's any surprises here. Take a look, read it yourself. This presentation is going to be available for you. But it's basically everything we've talked about. And finally, take-home messages. First take-home message is your business model depends on your priorities. This is your decision to make. Partly, you make it because of the product or service that you think of, but partly it's also what you want out of life. You have to seek investment consistent with your business model. Otherwise, you're in for a world of pain. If you're trying to get a licensed model financed by VCs, you're going to get rejected all over the place. Financing has to be consistent with the model. If you want to establish a long-term independent company, you have to tell people that. There are a lot of people in Canada who say, I'd like to support a long-term independent company. You just have to find them. When you're starting a company, you have to consider what the market is going to look like, not now, but after you've developed your product. If you're developing a class 3 product, that product's not going to be on the market for 5 to 10 years. What's the market going to look like then? Maybe it's a hot market now. Have I missed the boat? If you're developing class 1 or class 2 products, it's a lot easier to look forward to that. One of the significant messages today is that accepting other people's money results in a loss of control. There is absolutely nothing you can do about it. And it's actually, if you think about it, it's fair. It's their money. It is possible to manage for early acquisition. And finally, talk to your customers. If you're designing a company to be acquired, your customers are the acquiring companies. If you're designing a company with license model, your customers are the companies that are going to license that technology from you. Talk to them early, make sure you're doing the right thing. Don't go down blind alleys without this kind of feedback. Yeah.
Sorry, I just want to interrupt here. How early when you say early, like before an MVP or talking to your people who might acquire it?
I think the first thing you probably have to do is file a provisional patent so that at least you've got some protection. But then right away, I would start talking to people. So if you're designing, I had a company in Colorado was designing a surgical heart valve. This was about 8 years ago, and wanted me to be on their board. I knew the head of business development at Edwards. Went to see him. He said, oh no, we'd never acquire that. I said, we're looking for TAVR type devices, and that's all we're going to do. And he says, you're going to find that with everybody. So right away, it keeps you from going down blind alleys by talking to people, getting their opinion. You don't have to reveal big secrets. You don't have to, tell them exactly how your technology works. You just say, I've got a technology and it's going to provide this benefit. Would that eventually be of interest to you? And they'll tell you. Okay, well, I've gone 10 minutes over. Sorry about that. Yes?
You mentioned that class 1, class 2. What do you mean?
Oh, sorry. That's either FDA or Health Canada classes. So every medical device has to be approved by regulatory agencies, and there are different risk levels. So the agencies all have different classes. In Canada, there's 4 classes. Class 1 being the easiest, you hardly require any paperwork at all, and Class 4 being the most difficult, clinical trials required, everything else. FDA has 3 classes, and Europe has basically 4 classes too. Yeah.
Do you have a hybrid of more than one model, or is that
Yes.
comparison?
No, I mean, everything I've told you today, these are not hard and fast rules, right? Nobody's going to come and arrest you if you don't do it exactly this way. There are all kinds of hybrids, but hybrids are difficult. If you're a licensed model, for example, and you decide to produce your own product, then the customers you're licensing to say, you're competing with us. You're licensing to us and you're competing with us. How do you manage that? So there are lots of hybrids available, but they're difficult to do. Baylis for a long time was a hybrid of a long-term independent plus a distributor. They were doing both. Eventually they dropped the distribution altogether, but they were a hybrid. So hybrids do exist. Okay, yes?
So in your experience, when you go talk to venture capitalists versus big companies who can invest in you,
Right.
are the expectations of fast growth is different? Because, like, for example, I'm in MRI, so if I go talk to MRI, whether maybe they are interested in it, but more careful than say I'm the VC, so are they?
Okay, so
Better approach like you.
yes, they have different interests. So if you talk to manufacturers, they're more interested in synergy. They're more interested in what can your product do for my product. And if you're talking to venture capitalists, they're more interested in the exit potential, how much it's going to cost to get there, that sort of thing. Now, there are corporate venture capitalists. So Johnson & Johnson has a venture capital arm, for example, and so do most of the rest of the big companies. And they're a bit of a hybrid between venture capitalists but they won't typically invest at the very early stage. They'll invest once you have proven some clinical efficacy, typically. Yeah.
Do you have other strategies to augment the value of your diagnostic product? Let's say, I'm thinking one of if it's a synergetic effect with a therapeutic company.
Right.
Maybe you can sell it and then their sales is going to grow because of your diagnostic product.
Yeah, that's good thinking.
So, would you have in mind another strategies?
Well, the best thing that you can do to increase value is to somehow design a high-value disposable along with your diagnostic product. So, for example, if you have an ultrasound, the only disposable thing you use is gel. Well, gel's not worth much, and there's 1 million people making it. But if you have an ultrasound console in cardiology, well, you can make an ultrasound catheter, an IVUS catheter, for example. So that's a high-value disposable, and you sell your capital equipment because it's necessary to run the high-value disposable, but you will dramatically increase your valuation if you have a disposable. Yeah.
With for instance, switching business models,
Uh-huh.
at what point where you can't turn back on the route you've chosen? What factors are being associated with that?
Well, there's really no point. I mean, companies pivot all the time. By the time you're at that point, you have a board of directors. I mean, for myself, we started out as consultants, and I had completed developing a medical device for a Canadian company, and just as it was completed, I got a call from the president of the company, and he said, our sales manager just quit, and I need somebody to sell this device. and you know it better than anybody because you developed it. So go sell it for me and I'll pay you a commission. And I'd never sold anything before, but I tried it and I sold it. And I went back and I looked at my partner and I said, in the consulting business, it's a 3-step process. We have to sell the consulting job, then we have to do the work, and then we get paid. But in the distribution business, it's 2 steps. You sell the product and you get paid. So maybe we should do that. So we pivoted and we became a distributor, and it worked out really well. So companies pivot all the time, and even big companies can pivot. Thank you very much.